The haunted house of the bell, which there are stories that scare, others that intrigue, but few are those that remain alive for centuries, echoing from generation to generation like a secret that can never be buried. The legend of the bell, which is not just a horror tale. It is a real, documented enigma, witnessed by dozens of people, including a future president of the United States. What happened on the quiet farm of the Bell family in Tennessee remains unexplained to this day. Was it a case of mass hysteria, a genuine supernatural phenomenon, or something much worse, something that defies what we know about reality itself? What is most frightening about this story is not the recorded events, but the fact that the echoes of this dark past still persist. Even after more than 200 years, there are reports of apparitions, whispers, and strange phenomena in the area where the Bell House once stood. Some believe the entity never left. It simply waits for the right moment to manifest again. Others say that once you hear the story, you become part of it, and that at some point in the silence of the night, you may hear a voice in the dark calling your name. But what about you? What would you do if confronted with something that cannot be explained? Something that knows your deepest fears and whispers them back to you? The story you are about to read is not just a dark account. It is a warning, a reminder that sometimes what we believe to be just a legend may be more alive than we imagine. If you continue, know that it may be too late to turn back. It all began subtly. Small noises at night, objects out of place, an unusual coldness in certain parts of the house. John Bell, the family patriarch, dismissed the events as products of imagination, while his wife Lucy felt a growing unease. But the children were the first to witness something truly strange. Whispers coming from the darkness, voices that did not belong to anyone in the house. Something was there, watching. The manifestations quickly intensified. Knocking on the walls became constant. Shadows moved in the corners of their eyes, and the whispers evolved into intelligible murmurs. It seemed as if an invisible presence wanted to be noticed. Betsy Bell, the youngest daughter, began waking up with scratches on her body. At first, they thought it was a sleepwalking issue or even an attack by a small animal, but the marks were deep, precise, and worsened every night. The family tried to keep the secret, but the events became impossible to hide. During dinners, utensils moved on their own, doors slammed shut, and sinister laughter echoed through the empty house. Neighbors began to suspect that something strange was happening on the Bell property. And then one October night, the entity finally spoke. And that was when the real terror began. The silence of the night was broken by a hoarse whisper that seemed to come from every corner of the house at once. At first, the family tried to ignore it, but the voice insisted, calling the Bells by name, laughing softly in the dark. It was an invisible presence, but impossible to ignore. As the days passed, it grew stronger. It began to finish sentences spoken by the residents, to laugh at their attempt to pray, to answer questions before they were even asked. Fear became a constant shadow within the house. John Bell, a practical man, tried to confront the voice. He asked who or what was there. The answer came like thunder in the darkness. I am an old soul, cursed to wander this earth. But this was no ordinary spirit. It was something that knew their secrets, that whispered painful truths and exposed the deepest fears of each family member. The next day, John fell ill. His face was pale, his hands trembled, and the voice mocked him every night. Betsy Bell was the most tormented. The entity not only spoke to her, but also touched her. Her hair was violently pulled. Her arms and legs bore bruises, and her screams echoed through the house every night. The family called neighbors to witness the events, and it was then that the entity revealed something even more terrifying. It knew the secrets of everyone who entered the house. It whispered in the ears of visitors, called them by names no one else knew, and laughed at their hidden sins. There was no escape. The entity was not limited to the Bell house. Whatever was there seemed to feed on the fear and despair of the people. Anyone who visited the farm left changed, shaken. It was as if something invisible followed them to their homes, whispering in the dark, pulling off blankets, making objects disappear. It didn't take long for rumors to spread throughout Tennessee. People from neighboring towns began gathering on the property to witness the phenomenon. Some left laughing, disbelieving, but most left pale, wide-eyed, unable to explain what they had witnessed. The voice grew louder, clearer, crueler. It began calling John Bell a cursed man. Whenever he tried to pray, he was interrupted by cold, distorted laughter. If he tried to ignore it, something touched him, an invisible pressure on his chest, a cold hand gripping his shoulder in the middle of the night. He was wasting away. His children knew it, his wife knew it, but the voice never let them talk about it. Whenever someone tried to discuss John's health, furniture fell on its own, plates shattered against the walls, and doors locked without explanation. Betsy Bell could no longer sleep. Her face was always tired, her skin marked by scratches. The entity seemed obsessed with her. It called her name with a tone both sweet and perverse. "Betsy, you belong to me." When she cried, the voice whispered in her ear, "Crying won't save you." The family tried calling pastors, mediums, anyone who could expel the presence. But the voice just laughed and challenged them. "You think you can send me away?" it said. "I've always been here, and I always will be." Betsy Bell was no longer the same girl. The sleepless nights, the unexplained bruises, and the weight of the evil presence on her shoulders had turned her into a shadow of her former self. She tried to stay strong, but the entity gave her no respite. Any moment of silence was broken by insistent whispers. "Betsy, you can't escape." She felt invisible hands holding her face, scratching her skin, pulling her hair. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she felt the mattress sink as if someone were lying beside her. The situation worsened when Betsy became engaged to a young man named Joshua Gardner. He was a kind boy, loved by the family and neighbors. But the entity hated Joshua. Whenever he visited the farm, there were knocks on the walls. The horses became agitated for no apparent reason, and objects were thrown at him. One night, as Betsy and Joshua talked under a tree in the yard, the voice whispered in their ears, "You will never be happy with him." The whisper was accompanied by a sharp pain in her head, as if something were pressing on her skull. That was the night Betsy fainted for the first time. Her body fell to the ground like a lifeless doll. Joshua tried to wake her, but she seemed to be in a trance, whispering incomprehensible words. When she finally regained consciousness, she didn't remember what had happened. From then on, the episodes became frequent. Whenever she thought of her fiancé, a sense of despair overwhelmed her. The entity wanted Betsy to be alone, and it was willing to do anything to achieve that. While Betsy was tormented night after night, John Bell felt his strength fading. The once robust family patriarch could no longer get out of bed for long periods. His skin was pale, his eyes sunken, and a constant tremor dominated his hands. But the worst part wasn't the mysterious illness. It was a voice that never left him alone. It whispered in his ear while he slept, always repeating the same sentence. "John Bell, your time is coming." The family tried to help him, but the entity seemed to savor his suffering. When Lucy, his wife, brought him food, the voice mocked. "Do you really think this will help him? The poison is already in his veins." The most disturbing part was that John felt a strange taste in his mouth whenever he ate or drank something. He began to suspect that the entity was poisoning his food. But how could something invisible do that? The answer came in a terrifying way. One morning, John could no longer get up. His condition had worsened drastically. Beside him, a small vial of dark liquid was found. The voice then echoed through the house. "I gave this to him. I made him drink it. John Bell will never rise again." The family was in despair. They tried calling doctors, but nothing helped. Whatever was on the Bell farm wanted John dead, and no one could stop it. In the winter of 1820, John Bell took his last breath. His body was too weak to resist, and his mind had already been torn apart by constant terror. But death brought no relief to the family. It only brought more dread. When the patriarch of the house drew his last breath, the entity let out a thunderous laugh that echoed through every corner of the farm. It was celebrating. "I've won. John Bell is dead." The words were spoken with a clarity impossible to ignore. The family, overcome with grief and fear, tried to maintain dignity at the funeral, but the entity wouldn't allow it. Throughout the ceremony, muffled laughter could be heard among the prayers, as if someone invisible were there, mocking their sorrow. When they finally lowered the coffin into grave, the voice sang a distorted melody, a kind of macabre chant that made some guests run away in horror. The pastor himself, who was conducting the ceremony, dropped the Bible from his hands upon hearing it. But the nightmare didn't end with John's death. That same night, the entity returned to torment Betsy with even greater intensity. It seemed that now that the patriarch was dead, it had plenty of energy to focus entirely on her. The whispers became screams, the physical attacks more violent, and the feeling of an invisible gaze on her shoulders became unbearable. It was as if something wanted to devour her completely, and she knew she couldn't resist much longer. John Bell's death brought no peace to the house. On the contrary, it seemed to fuel the entity even more. Betsy felt her sanity crumbling day by day. The spirit now not only spoke to her, but invaded her dreams, distorting her reality in unimaginable ways. She dreamed of faceless shadows watching her from the foot of the bed, of invisible hands pulling her into the void, and worst of all, of her father, John Bell, whispering, "There's no escape, my daughter. She has always been here." The relationship between Betsy and Joshua Gardner quickly fell apart. Whenever he approached, something happened. A cold wind swept through the room. The house shook. The voice mocked him. "You will never have Betsy," it whispered, full of malice. Betsy began to feel a deep anguish every time she saw her fiancé. The love she once felt seemed to dissolve into fear and uncertainty. Until one day, without warning, she simply told Joshua they could no longer be together. He tried to argue, but the truth was she couldn't explain the reason herself. It was as if something inside her had been forcibly ripped out. After that, the entity calmed down. For a while, there were no more physical attacks, no more screams in the middle of the night, just an oppressive silence that enveloped the house like a shroud. Betsy thought she might be free, that she might have done what the entity wanted. But then, in the darkness of her room, one last phrase echoed at the foot of her ear: "I will return." After the engagement was broken off, the entity seemed to lose interest in Betsy. The Bell farm was engulfed in a sepulchral silence. No whispers, no slamming doors, no sinister laughter echoing through the rooms. It was as if something had simply vanished into thin air, leaving behind only emptiness. Betsy, traumatized and fragile, took advantage of the calm to leave the family home. She married another man years later and moved on with her life, but always with the feeling that something was watching her in the dark. Betsy's mother, Lucy Bell, and the other children tried to rebuild what was left of the family, but the shadow of the entity never truly left them. There were nights when someone swore they heard footsteps upstairs, even when no one was there. Other times, an almost imperceptible whisper broke the silence, only to disappear moments later. Time passed, and the Bells learned to live with the uncertainty. But they never forgot. The story of the Bell, which spread throughout Tennessee and, over the years, became one of the most documented legends in American folklore. Many skeptics tried to debunk the events, but the accounts remain alive. The Bell House no longer exists, but the land remains there untouched, as if guarding something invisible, waiting for a new name to call. It is said that even today, those who pass through those lands may hear a whisper laden with malice and wind. "I never left." Even after the Bell farm was abandoned, the story never died. Generations passed, but the legend persisted, as if the land itself had memorized every whisper, every scream, every secret buried by time. Locals avoided the area, and those who ventured there reported disturbing experiences. Shadows moving among the trees, voices murmuring their names, an oppressive feeling of being watched. The wind that blew through the area carried more than dust. It carried echoes of a past that refused to be forgotten. Over the years, paranormal researchers visited the site in hopes of unraveling the truth behind the legend. Some left as skeptics, with no concrete evidence, but others returned changed. They reported feelings of déjà vu, as if they had been there before, even though they knew they had never set foot on that land. One researcher swore he heard his own name called by a female voice, a voice he would never forget. He never returned. The mystery surrounding the Bell, which continues to grow, fueled by new accounts, by witnesses who cannot forget what they saw or heard. Many believe the entity never left, simply waiting for the right moment to manifest again. But the question remains, what does it really want? Revenge entertainment, or just to remind the world that some stories never truly end. Time may bury stories, but it never completely erases the traces of what happened. The case of the Bell Witch is still studied, debated, and, for many, feared. The farm no longer exists, but reports of paranormal activity in the area persist. People who camp nearby claim to hear inexplicable murmurs in the middle of the night, muffled laughter, and even feel cold touches on their shoulders when no one else is around. The most disturbing part? Those who dare to speak too much about the legend always end up having nightmares. Nightmares where they are back in the Bell House, surrounded by shadows, while a familiar voice whispers, "I'm still here." Curious individuals and paranormal investigators continue to return to the site, trying to find a definitive answer to the mystery. Some evidence has been captured: recordings of strange noises, photographs with unexplained silhouettes, and testimonies from people who simply disappear for hours, only to reappear with no memory of what happened. The entity, whatever it is, seems to have lost none of its thirst for attention. But one thing is certain: no one who delves too deeply into the story comes out unscathed. So, what really happened at the Bell House? Was it a vengeful spirit, a force beyond human comprehension, or just the collective delusion of a time haunted by superstitions? Perhaps we will never know the truth. But if one day you hear your name whisper in the dark, feel a sudden chill on the back of your neck, or sense that something is watching you, ask yourself, has the Bell Witch found a new home?